Hello and howdy, welcome to my first Angular app. This is a video tutorial taught by yours truly, Alyssa Nichol, and I could not be more excited that you're taking this first step into what I believe is an incredible framework, but also an amazing community. So welcome to Angular and let's get started. So a bit of a primer on getting up and running with your first Angular application. Now, normally, and when I say normally, I mean from my perspective as a developer and what I've seen most of the time. You'll be working with either terminal or command line and some sort of code editor. I personally use VS Code. And you use these in conjunction together to generate your application, to build onto it, using something called the Angular CLI. And that has commands. And I'll actually go ahead and show you. So we're going to go into my development folder and we'll make a new folder called tutorial. If I can spell. I think that's right. We're going to say it's right. So inside of tutorial, we will now start using the CLI, and we can say things like ng, which is short for Angular. And we can say ng new for a new project and say my new project, and that'll be the name of the project. And now you'll see the CLI at work with its very first question. Do you want to enforce stricter type checking? So at this point, you go through and answer its questions, and you choose which type of style sheet formatting you would like. Always a CSS for me, thanks. And then it's going to go ahead and create the project, install the npm packages, and we'll be able to run it. Easy as that. Instead of going this route, though, what we shall do in this tutorial is use something called StackBlitz. StackBlitz allows you to do all of this within any browser of your choosing. So if you go to stackblitz.com, you should see something similar to this. This is my list of projects, so you won't have a list of projects if you've never used StackBlitz before, but you have the option to create a new project, and we of course want the Angular TypeScript option here. So when we click into that, this is similar to the command we just saw in the terminal. It creates a new starter project, and we're ready to go, off and running. It's obviously much faster, so if we go back over to my terminal, you'll see I'm still installing over here. Whereas StackBlitz has not only installed everything, but it's running. It started the project. So if I go into, just to kind of prove what I'm talking about, if I go into here and I say howdy instead of hello, you'll see howdy happen over here as well. And so this is why I love StackBlitz. It is absolutely 10 out of 10 for learning new things, because you don't have to wait on installs. You don't have to make sure you have everything like any dependencies or CLIs installed to be able to do something. You go to stackblitz.com and you click on an Angular project, and within 10 seconds you should be ready to get started. So create a StackBlitz account if you have not, and you can pause at any point, of course, and come back to this. But once you have one, go ahead and create the Angular application that you saw me do. And I'm going to walk through a couple of building blocks before we get started with building out our first Angular app. So over here, we have our list of dependencies that StackBlitz deemed necessary to install for our starter Angular application. This is useful so that you know, like, let's say I want to install some Kendo UI components and start throwing them in my project. Well, this is where you would go ahead and enter in that package name and install from there. So we can go ahead and collapse the dependencies. We don't need to worry about those right now, just so you know where they are or what they are. And I'm actually going to make the font a bit bigger, just so that you can see it easier. So let's walk through our application tree, shall we? So here inside of source is where all the goodies lie. Outside of source, we have an Angular JSON package JSON and a tsconfig JSON. We're just going to leave those alone for now. They have some default things, like if we scroll down to line 26, you'll see it's pointing to our styles.css. And this is where, of course, you would change it to like SCSS if you wanted to use that instead, or a SAS, or et cetera, et cetera. And these are all things that are used to bootstrap your application, get it up and running. And we can dive more into those, but I think the fun part is going to be inside source. So let's dive in. Once we're inside of source, you'll see that we have an index.html, and you'll see this my app, and a little loading indicator, which I think, yeah, we can get it to show up. If we refresh our application, you'll see while the app is loading, over in the right, you have a little loading indicator buddy spiraling. And you might be wondering at this point, who is my app? Let's go into the app folder, and if we open up, let's open up app component. Can I make this a little bit bigger? Yeah, a little bit bigger. So inside of app component.typescript, you will see that same selector that we saw before, my-app. And what is happening here? Well, Angular, as with many things in the JavaScript world, depends on and is built from components. So my app is a component, as you can see here, at component, that was built out by default for you. And this is the template that it's pointing to. So you can see the app component HTML. And then also this is the style sheet that it's pointing to, app component.css. And here you can see that we're giving, let's give all paragraphs a background of purple, please. Or actually, let's make it Rebecca purple. That's my favorite. And let's give the color of all paragraphs white so they can be seen. And some padding because I feel claustrophobic now. So yes. As you can see, as we work with the CSS and we're changing it, its updates are happening live, and you can save your project up here. I recommend doing it. You can actually also use the keyboard shortcut Command S for saving on a Mac, and I think it is Control S for saving on a Windows. So as you're typing and changing and updating files, make sure you're saving, whether you're buttoning or hotkeying. So back over to, I'm going to close out our CSS, back over to our TypeScript file, our component. Let's look a little bit more at what's happening. So we've got this thing called a decorator in Angular, and this is saying, hey, Angular, we are creating a new component. And inside, these three things are pretty much required. You need a selector, so the name of that component. You need a template, so that is going to be the markup, and this is where we can also say, start editing magic here. And so, so excited to learn Angular, and you'll see it should update as we go in the view over here. So, we have these three things that are required, and then we are exporting that class because I don't know if you know this, but I think it's kind of like turtles. It all comes down to turtles in the end. Well, I think it all comes down to classes in the end. And so, yes, the component is a class called app component. And here we are creating a variable called name, and we're setting it equal to a string of Angular plus the version major. So that's why it's saying howdy Angular 12. Whereas if you were to, I don't know, follow this tutorial in another like 4 months or so, the version major would be 13. And so et cetera, as you go on forward in time. So we could also set name equals howdy there, and boop. Trying to comment out. So now you'll see that that name variable is being pulled into our template, which is using it to set right here in this hello tag. And let me just save, because anytime you see, if I make a change here, you'll see anytime you see this dot next to the file name, that means there are unsaved changes. So yes, This right here, we are binding that name variable here, and this bracket lets Angular know, oh, hey, that is actually a variable. That's something I need to interpolate and plug in here. Because as you may know, if you're familiar with HTML, oftentimes you can do things in line. Like, for instance, we'll say class equals, and we'll say, hello, class here. So this is like a normal way of using an attribute. Normal. What is normal? This is a normal way of using an attribute where you set it equal to a string. But once you're inside a string and you're like, it's time, I need to do some math, or I need to do plug in bind a variable. That is where the beautiful curly braces, or I believe some call them mustaches, come into play. Now, if you got a little overwhelmed during this tour, don't worry. We're going to go over some of those concepts that we just talked about a little bit slower as we start to build out our application. So if you'd like to follow along, again, create a StackBlitz account and create your first Angular application, and then you should be ready to follow the next step. And so what we're going to do is create a new component. And so we could use, like I said, the Angular CLI that would generate all of the needed files and boilerplate for us. But we are going to use StackBlitz, which makes it so much easier. So we're going to go to the app folder and select it by right-clicking the component option. And there's this Angular generator that comes down. So we're going to say Angular generator component. And this prompt is asking what we'd like to call it. And we are going to create a to-do application today. So we will call it a to-do component. And you'll see over here, we have a folder called to-do, and it has 3 files, a style sheet, a template file, and a component file. And this is the component file that it's opened by default here. And you can see where it's went ahead and plugged in the template and the style sheet for us. And it's also generated the to-do component class. And they've created this lovely ngOnInit, this constructor, and imported those from Angular core as well, which we will talk about all of those pieces in a moment. But the first thing I want to do, if we go ahead and open up our template, you'll see that there's a paragraph that says to-do works. So if we go into our app component HTML, which is where we have that hello component, and it's where we have a paragraph. Below both of these, let's go ahead and say app-to-do, and voila, to-do works. So what just happened there, if you might be a little lost, is we created a new to-do component, and then we used its app-to-do selector inside of our main app component.html. All right, so we used app-to-do, and that's saying, hey, go ahead and import that component. Go ahead and insert it into the DOM at this point. And so to-do works is being rendered below our paragraph and below our hello component. And so I am super, super excited that you've created, congratulations, your first component. But let's take it a step further. Let's go back into our component file of the to-do component, and let's go ahead and make a variable. And we will say, let's go just right inside your class. We'll call it a title, and we'll give it a type of string, and we'll set it equal to a string. And then let's go ahead and inside of our template, which is over here, todo.component.html, let's go ahead and use that title. And so let's say, instead of to-do works, we'll say, actually, instead of a paragraph, let's create a header. We'll create like an H2, and we will insert, that title variable. And so let's go back over to this, and instead of it being a string, why don't we actually give it a result? So we'll bind it to something, I don't know, fancier than an empty string. Let's make up a company. I'm going to call it Backstreet. Backstreet will be Backstreet Bakery. I'm into like some baked goods lately. When am I not into baked goods? So let's say Backstreet Bakery ToDo App. So that's the title. And as you can see, it is being bound beautifully to this title here, this little inside of our template, which is like, mwah, gorgeous. If we want to add a string to it, we can, like if we wanted to go ahead and augment and keep typing and add things afterwards that are static. But I think, let's go ahead and save this. The next step is just to kind of break down what's happening inside the component. So we've talked about creating component and using that component inside of our application. But now I really want to dive into what is this constructor business? What is this ngOnInit that's being implemented for us? How kind. And what are they used for? And so the constructor happens right whenever the component is created in the DOM, when it's initialized. And ngOnInit, as you can imagine, it also happens initially. If we go to the Angular docs, I love to pull up the docs. If we go to the Angular docs and we search for ngOnInit, you'll see that onInit is a lifecycle hook that is called after, and I'll make this font a little bit bigger for you. A lifecycle hook that is called after Angular has initialized all data-bound properties of a directive. But at this point, I'm still a bit fuzzy. There we go. I'm still a bit fuzzy on which one of these is going to fire first. So why don't we find out? Inside your constructor, let's go ahead and set title equal to let's set title equal to the constructor is changing everything. Oh no. And then inside of ngOnInit, we're going to set title to something totally different. ngOnInit has its paws on the title. Okay, cool. And of course we have angriness because they're scoped. We have scope. So what does that mean? It means we created title inside of our class. And so now it belongs to the to-do component. So in order to access it inside the constructor, we need to reference it with this. And we say this.title. Same thing inside of ngOnInit, this.title. And so if we actually have ngOnInit has its paws on the title. So I think that answers our question. The constructor does in fact happen very first thing off the bat. And then ngOnInit happens second. We can prove this by commenting out our ngOnInit, and you'll see that the constructor is changing everything. So these are really great to know. As far as I know, you might hear things like lifecycle hook, and you might just like run away and be frightened. And it's really not a big deal. What it's talking about is the order in which things happen in Angular, which we know that the constructor happens very first, and then ngOnInit will happen right after. So how do you know, though, when to use the constructor versus when to use ngOnInit? Well, the constructor in Angular should only be used to be quite honest, dependency injection. And we will get to that further down in this tutorial. And it's one of the reasons that people choose Angular and love Angular is because of its dependency injection. But so any work like this, if we're changing a title or setting something or calling a method or whatever we're doing, that should really happen inside of ngOnInit. That's where the workload should be happening for when your component is initialized, other than, of course, dependency injection. So make that note to yourself. Constructor is for dependency injection. Woohoo. Okay. And keep that in the back of your mind because we will be using it later. But for now, we don't need that gorgeous constructor. We're just going to delete it, save, and to move on. Something that I want to talk about at this time is binding. So as you see, we are binding our title here, but it's a basic string, right? It's just a string, and we're setting it to different things at different points in our class here, and then it gets set, right? It's pretty basic, but the expressions that we can bind to, and if I go back over here, you'll see this right here is called an expression inside of the curly braces. So the expressions that we bind to in the template are not limited to class properties. So for example, let's create a paragraph. I really thought P tab would work. I guess it's not working today. I don't know. Sometimes I think it does, question mark. Anyways, let's create a paragraph, and instead of title, let's do some math. So 2 + 2 equals 4. Wow, amazing. I know, it's pretty crazy. You can also bind to methods as well. So if we go over to our component file, and that is not the right component file. Let's clean up a little bit. Let's close all the things that I'm not using right this very moment. Closey, closey. Okay, so if we open up the component file and make a method, and we'll call this one change that title method, boop, boop, boop. And we'll say this dot title is now equal to, and we're going to set our initial one here instead of out there. And I think I'm going to be consistent and use the double strings. So now we have a method called change that title that sets title equal to Backstreet Bakery ToDo App. And if we go to the HTML and we create a new paragraph, or actually, let's get fancy. Let's make an H3. I don't know why I'm struggling to create basic elements today. I think it's because you're watching me. Okay. And bind it to change that title and call it. And so now between 4 and the H2 title, you see Backstreet Bakery ToDo, because it's calling that method, which is changing the title to that. So beautiful, wonderful, amazing. Let's go ahead and save it. Now, besides this string interpolation type of binding that we can do between the curly braces, we actually have a lot more options when it comes to data binding inside of Angular. So I want to talk about a couple more of those options before we continue building out. So another type of interpolation type data binding is, instead of just to an expression inside of the curly braces, you can actually bind to a property on the element itself. And so let's create an input, and it's type of text, and it's right there, and it's gorgeous. And we haven't really been keeping up with our styles too much. So let's go ahead in here and say input, and we want our font size to be massive. Perfect, beautiful. And I actually have a couple, let me grab, I've got some fun styles for us, and I didn't want to spend too long on the styles because I wanted to focus a lot on, I really wanted to focus a lot on our Angular-y bits versus our CSS-y bits. So I will actually upgrade our styles in a moment to be a bit more fancy, but we're just going to deal with a little bit larger so we can see it. And then inside of our template, it says type of text. Now let's go ahead and set the value property to, to do item, right? Because that's the type of form we are creating here. So it goes and it fills out the value of it by default to do item. There's also placeholder, which might be better. As you can see, it looks different and it's not already pre-filled out. And so placeholder is great for, it's kind of like an additional label to a form filled. So this is our to-do item placeholder, but we can also bind to this if we wanted to. So we surround the property that we want to bind to, and then we set it to, we're going to set it to a variable. So let's go ahead and make this a variable, because right now it is not a variable. So to-do item is going to be a string, and it's going to equal to-do item. Yeah. Let's lowercase that. Okay, so yes. So here you see another way of using data binding inside of Angular. Instead of just a simple expression or a method or a variable, we're actually binding a property of an element to data on the other side inside the component. So loving that. Let's chug right along to the next type of data binding I wanted to cover. We won't cover them all, but we should cover quite a few. The next type of binding I want to talk about that's used quite frequently is event binding. When something happens, like on this event, go ahead and bind this thing. And so let's dive into it. But on the way to the event binding, I'd like to clean up our template a smidge because we have a lot of example bits in here. So the input we're going to go ahead and use, and let's see, I really do want the Backstreet Bakery title in here. So let's go to our component, and instead of setting the title that we actually want inside of change that title, let's go ahead and set that inside of ngOnInit. We can clean up that method that we're no longer going to be calling. And so we've got our title here that's set to a string, our to-do item that is set to, let's say to do today. And yes, I'm pretty happy with that. And then we've got our ngOnInit. And then if we go back over here, we have an H2 with our title. We have our input, but we have a bunch of extra bits that we could call that we don't need, like that default hello component. So let's go ahead and just delete everything up above our app to do. And we can go ahead and delete that hello component too. We're not using it. And it's angry because we're still bootstrapping in hello component even though we're not using it. So let's delete that, save that, and then let's see, deleted that, we cleaned up that, and I think we're pretty good. We're not actually using name anywhere either, so we can delete that. Okay, so as promised earlier, we would add a bit of fanciness to our application, a bit of fun, and I think our header can go ahead and be an H1. I think that's what needs to happen. And then let's go ahead. I like to start off by creating wrappers and trying to make them semantic or give them good class names. So we're going to call this a class of to-do form. And that's where our input will live, that creates to-dos. But we also have a button. And that button is going to be where we get to use our first event binding. Hooray. Button. And we're going to say maybe save. I think we can always change it. We can always change it to create or something extravagant later. Okay. And then let's see. Let's tab this over and create a paragraph. A paragraph, it's what we're creating. And this is going to be, I guess, where this is like the, well, it's really where our to-do list needs to be, which wouldn't be a paragraph. It'd be like a unordered list of some sort. So let's go ahead and create our unordered list, but of course it won't be populated with beautifulness quite yet. We're just kind of prepping for when we actually have to-do item. Okay, cool. But this section is for the actual form, and this will be for class, we'll call it to-do list. Beautiful. Okay, so now we've got our basic pieces, and I'm pretty like, yay, pieces. But I am a little, let's fix the Backstreet Bakery to-do app. I'm wondering if we should capitalize the D in do. I never know. So if that's bothering you, I apologize. Let's add in some styles real quick as promised. And I'm going to kind of shotgun us forward a little bit. So I got inspired by this retro, I'm going to call it a retro ice cream theme. And so inside of our styles.css, I am actually going to plop in my variables that we will be using throughout the building of this application. These are some colors, and these hamster and squirrel are unit values that we'll use in a little bit. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to say body and give it a color of brown using that brown variable. And that's changing the font of the whole body to that. And then the font size to hamster, which is telling everything to be 16 by default. So now we can actually go into our to-do and get rid of that. We don't need to override this just yet. So we're going to put our generic styles inside of style.css. And then once we kind of need more specifics, we can put them inside of this to-do component CSS encapsulation. And I think we might already be experiencing issues because I gave body font size for our hamster, which is 16 pixels. But I'm thinking that we're not actually seeing that. That might be 16. Let's go ahead and inspect and find out. So if we open up our Chrome inspector and hover over that tool and click on our input, and we scroll, I'm not seeing, yeah, so body, it's being overridden. This is very tiny fonts. I'm going to make it as big as I dare. So it looks like this input, its font size is being overridden, I think, by the browser default font, this 13.333 pixels. Oh, goodness. You gotta love specificity. So what that tells me is that I need to be a little bit more specific than the browser defaults. So I'm going to actually call out the input itself, give it border, font size, etc., etc. You'll see this transition, and we'll talk about that fancy business in a minute. We're just going to cover some basic styles that I created for our app. I'm also going to give the body and the button the same white background. And let's see, I need our input on focus. I did some fun work with box shadows, which you will see in a moment. But here we're going to give it a border, an outline, and a box shadow. And that's what we're actually transitioning on focus, which we'll see in a moment when I click into it. But our button needs some base styles as well as fancy styles. So let's go down to here and say, button, hello button. That's much better. So now our button is at least the same size as our to-do input. So we've got this font size, color, border, and the same transition on box shadow. And then we're setting the box shadow on focus to something gorgeous that I'll show you in a moment. I'm holding it. I'm holding the reveal. Don't worry, you will not be disappointed. Lastly, I made just like a mega most wonderful, please don't hate me because I absolutely am in love with this. I made a box shadow. A text shadow, excuse me, not a box shadow. I made a text shadow for our H1 and it is glorious. And it looks a bit overwhelming, but don't be intimidated. So I created a bunch of different layers for this, like I said, retro ice cream gradient that I was in love with. And I picked out different colors along that gradient and made this layered effect. So if we make our view a little bit bigger, oh yeah, that's it. That's the money. You'll see this absolutely gorgeous. I love it. I'm in love. I think it is the way to go. I feel very right about this decision. The font size is a little bit big, but it's supposed to be chunky. So we're gonna leave it at least at 90, I think. But I think we have boop boop boop. We still need to style our wrapper, which we might do. We might do that because I think we're at the extent of what what we could consider our generic styles. Because if I create a form anywhere else or an H1 anywhere else or a button anywhere else, I'm probably going to want it to have these matching styles. So I'm okay with that. But I want to center our to-do form. So let's go ahead and give it a display of flex, justify center, and a gap so that it's centered on the page nicely. I'm much happier with that. So now if we go back down, I wanted to talk with you about, not that. Although, actually, those styles, I don't think we need those anymore because we have base styles in our styles.css. that are overriding that. So the last surprise that I had for you was the box shadows that I added here, and I'm just in love with. So it should be really fun as we start to create to-do items and click the button, it gets added to the list. To have this, I don't know, I'm going to call it my retro ice cream dream theme. We could go ahead and split our CSS variables out into a separate style sheet called maybe variables.css. Maybe if we have time at the end, we will. But for right now, we are only using them in this root style sheet, and so I'm okay with it being here. Now, before we get to binding that click event, let's clean up our workspace just a little bit. So let's go ahead and just close all of these tabs. And I actually want to name this since whenever you fork a project, it gives you this Angular Ivy forked name by default. So I'm going to name it my first Angular app, since that's the name of this tutorial. And then I will say working, since this is the working copy. There's also an end copy floating around out there on StackBlitz if you would like to jump to the end. Let's also collapse our dependencies and pull up our to-do bits, because this is where we're going to be finishing out our to-do app. So I think it would be great if our to-do items here were actually listing out real items. And so I'm just going to leave this to-do item blank and not set it just yet. And then I'm also going to create an array, and this is where our to-do items will actually be stored. And so now we have a to-do items array and a singular to-do item. And then if we go ahead and save and go back to our HTML now, this is what we're going to want to do. On button click, we're going to want to take the value of our input here and push it into the array. And our UL is going to loop over the items in that array and list them out with the LI. So let's go ahead and create some steps here. First things first, we need the input value to be bound to do item. And once that value is bound, we can then add an event binding to the button, which will update the to-do items list with to-do item. And then finally, loop through to-do items in our UL. So now first things first, input value to be bound to to-do item. And we are going to do this with a magical thing called ngModel. So if we go ahead and open up the Angular docs and show you, and I'm going to make the font a little bit bigger. So you can actually display a data property and update that property when the user makes changes to it with ngModel. And this example in the docs that we're going to be referencing is using a single case of it. So here we need to import the forms module in our app module.ts file in order to have access to ngModel, which if we go to our app module, you'll see that I've already done it for you. So next step. Now we can use this fun, what's been referenced, this syntax as banana in the box syntax, to bind ngModel. And here they are doing it on an input, which is how we are going to be doing it. So let's go back over to close out our module file. Let's go back over to our HTML, and on the input, we'll use the banana in a box syntax here and say ngModel is equal to, and this is the to-do item that we want to bind that to, and get some space here. And so next we need to go ahead, and we're actually getting some errors here. So let's check out what's happening. Failed to execute set attribute on element. Okay, let's find out. Oh, it's because I totally put the entire banana around the whole thing, which is a goof. Okay, woof. Here we go. So sorry about that. So ngModel is surrounded by both the brackets and the parentheses, and it is being bound to our to-do item. To prove this to you, let's go ahead and give it a default value again. So we'll say buy more flour. Our bakery is out. And then over here, you'll see that the placeholder is updating, right? But let's go ahead and prove that we are binding something, and we'll just throw the to-do item in. Whoops, it's all one variable. We'll just throw the to-do item in here. And so now if I say hi or hello, which this, sometimes is useful, especially like when you are searching, right? You want something to actively change while you're doing it. So maybe while you're typing or something, you're running a search. But this was just for demonstration purposes to show that we are actually binding to do item. So part 1, check. Next one, add an event binding to the button so that on button click, we're actually saving or updating that list. So let's say this is how you will bind to an event, and we're doing the click event, of course. And we're saying on click, I want to call this method the update list method, which of course there is an error. The update list does not exist, and you want to know why? It's because it doesn't exist yet. So let's go ahead and create that method, and we're going to now do step number 3, which is update the to-do items list with to-do item. So we're going to say this. We're doing this very simply, not very elegantly, and I'm okay with that. This dot to-do items. And then we're going to call push on the array, and we will push in this dot to do item, that singular item. Beautiful. And we might even at this point reset to do item so that after the list is updated, it's back to an empty string. That might be handy, right? Okay, so I think we're ready. Let's get rid of this default. And let's find out what happens. I'm so excited. Okay, so we still have that. We haven't updated our list yet, so that's fine. And we're getting an error. What is it? Cannot read property push of undefined. And this is because we made the to-do items array, but we'd never instantiated it. So we need to actually say equals an empty array. And now we should be able to type, click save, and have no errors in our console. And you're like, but Alyssa, we still don't see our items, right? Like it's resetting, it's updating the list, but we don't see those items. And that's because we haven't done step 4 yet. The last, sometimes when you do the hotkey for save, it tries to do that. The last and final step, loop through the to-do items inside our UL. So there is another magical thing. There's so many magical things in Angular called ng4 that allows you to create a variable here in line. So let item of to-do items. So what this is doing is this is looping through our to-do items array and creating this reference here. And then we can actually plug that reference in wherever we please inside of here. To list it out. So this will loop and create an LI for every single to-do item we have. So buy flour, and then we click save, and then it wipes out. Beautiful. And then we say buy milk, and then we click save, and now we have a working to-do list, and it's beautiful, and we're so happy. So obviously this is a very simple way. We have an array, and it's not even persisting. If we refresh, we're going to lose our data. And this placeholder of undefined kind of bothers me a little bit. So what I'm going to do is instead of binding to do item, I'm actually just going to set a string of a new to do. And that way, whenever it gets wiped out, you see that simple string placeholder there. But like I said, there's obviously many steps further beyond this to make your data persist. And also, perhaps once it's persisting in a database, we start using an observable instead of just a simple array that's being created right here in the component. So there are many more things to learn, obviously, but I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Angular. I sure enjoyed teaching it. And make sure you keep a lookout on Progress's YouTube channel. I plan on having more episodes to expand this to-do series. And so thank you all so much for taking this journey into my first Angular app.